I don't know about you, but I love that little psalm. Isn't it exciting? Isn't it beautiful? We're looking forward to that time, aren't we? It's the time when all the earth will praise God. It's the time when God's laws will be established throughout the globe. It's the time when the people of Israel will be preserved and will be a strong nation in the center of the earth. And as we read, the verse I'm most interested in there is verse 8. Oh, I like verse 7 because, well, that's got dragons. But beside that, verse 8, fire and hail, snow and vapours, stormy winds fulfilling God's word. That's very promising. That's what we wanted, wasn't it? Good. Stormy winds fulfilling God's word. And that's really what we want to have a look at tonight. Because when you think about it, God has used storms, weather, again and again and again down through history in order to present the message he wishes to present to mankind, in order to control events, in order to make the world know that he is God and he rules in the kingdoms of men. And it's a tool that he's used over and over and over again to impose his will upon this globe. If you go back just one chapter, Psalm 147, he repeats this idea again. He says in verse 15, he sends forth his commandment upon the earth. God's word runs swiftly. God's commandment is running swiftly throughout the earth. And then it contrasts this idea. He sends forth his ice-like morsels. Who can stand before God's cold? God uses weather patterns to impose his word, his will upon the earth. Verse 18, he sendeth out his word and melteth them. Can you see how he's now blending the ideas of God's word, God's will, and the weather, the ice, the snow, the hail? He causeth his wind to blow, the wind of his purpose, and the waters flow. He showeth his word unto Jacob, his statutes and his judgments unto Israel. And again throughout history, God has used weather, hasn't he? The flood, classic example of a time where God used a spot of rain to teach humanity a lesson. He did it again in the time of Sisera, didn't he? Deborah and Barak benefited from God's use of the weather, perhaps the dividing of the Red Sea. Certainly in the time of the Lord Jesus Christ, where it was said of him that men marveled, saying, what manner of man is this that command the sea and the waves? Perhaps in the time of the Apostle Paul, when the great storm Euroclydon drove him to Melita and finally on to Rome. Again and again, God uses weather to fulfill his word. But tonight we're going to have a look at things outside the biblical record, or at least, shall we say, outside the history of the Bible, in the time from the end of the record of John and Revelation through to our day. And hopefully we can keep us all interested, because I know we've just had the main meal with Brother Don and with Brother Neville, and this is, I guess, in a sense, dessert. But by the end, hopefully, we can feel that we've had a well-rounded meal. We're all filled, and we go away convinced that we do live in the times of the end, that Christ is knocking on the door, if we would but hear it, and that we're almost there, and that God has tools that allow him very precisely to control exactly how events play out in our globe. So, what sort of wild weather do we have out there? Well, there's a list on the screen for you. We've got hurricanes and storms and hail, all the sorts of wild weather that we would normally think of, and God has used these again and again. We're going to add, for the purposes of tonight, a few extra things that might not normally be considered weather. They're more sort of environmental or seismic effects, but we're going to add them in to just give us a broader palette to work with this evening. So things like gale and El Nino, La Nina, frost, heatwave, earthquake, meteor, volcano and tsunami. Now, for those of you who are hoping that tonight I'm going to somehow bring meteors into the story, I'm sorry, I haven't got any meteors for you tonight, but we do have, throughout the course of this evening, we're going to look at least one volcano, in fact several volcanoes. There will be earthquakes as we go. There's definitely going to be a pirate, and there'll be some large bombs. So hopefully there's enough to keep even the youngest entertained as we go. But it is serious material, and of course we've been watching, haven't we? Our brother Don spoke to us earlier on about the events of the United Kingdom, and for those of us who were watching the weather, we would have been stunned to see what happened. Many of us wondered whether this here, the weather, the rain pounding down in London, in 24 hours, a month's worth of rain falling in London, a city relatively familiar, one would think, with rain, 24 hours and a month's worth of rain in London, the very place that was most likely to vote to remain in the EU. And of course we all wondered. We said to ourselves, is this the hand of God? Is God pushing events to work the way he wishes them to? Are the angelic meteorologists here pushing the clouds over London so that events happen the way God wants them to, with the timing God wants them to? And so what we want to do this evening is look at we're going to try, time pending, to look at 4 key periods of time and 4 key events. We're going to look at something in the reign of Justinian, and we're going to look at a big weather event in the time of Justinian, and we're going to see, hopefully, that yes, God changed the world using weather at that time. And you can see I've got a bit of an icon up here. This is a photograph of Justinian taken at the time using a very, very old iconic camera. Justinian, known as the last of the Romans, he was a Byzantine emperor, and we'll be having a look at events in his time. And we'll then move on, we'll come back to that. We'll then move on to talking about events that led up to the fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans in the 1400s. And the symbol we've got for him is this image here of Kublai Khan, one of the Mongol warlords and leader of the Golden Horde. We'll then move on to looking at the rise of Britain, and this gentleman here is the infamous pirate, Sir Francis Drake. And then finally we'll conclude, hopefully, by looking at Robespierre, a French lawyer known as the Soul of Terror. And as we go, on every slide you're going to see an image of one of these 4 individuals, and that'll help you work out exactly where we are in our timeline for this evening. So, weather. This here is a chart of the weather of global temperatures for the last 2,000 years. Now, some of you will immediately be saying that's pretty impressive. The Weather Office has only been around for the last 70 years. How did they work out what the weather was 100 years ago, let alone 500 or 1,000? We will come to that. But what I want us to particularly focus on is this section here, where you can see a sudden, rather cold snap occurring. The temperatures plunged around the world and is recorded in this long history. It's a relatively recent history from 2012, based on a vast study of weather patterns around the globe for the last 2,000 years. How did they get this magnificent chart that gives us the weather for the last 2,000 years? Well, they used a number of things. One of them is they used tree rings. And for those of you who have had a past career as a lumberjack, you will all know that you can tell what the weather's been like in a particular area by the tree rings. When you look at the tree rings, you'll be able to see that those rings of the tree that are larger indicate a good year, a year in which the temperature in the area in which this tree was growing was conducive to growing big trees, and the smaller rings means it's probably a year where there wasn't much rain or it was very, very hot and the poor tree suffered. Now you're probably thinking to yourselves, yes, but this is 2,000 years of history. Did some criminals go around cutting down a whole lot of 2,000-year-old trees in order to get this science? That would be just wrong. That's not actually what they did. They actually found a bunch of very, very old buildings. These buildings, some of them dating back thousands of years, and embedded in the heart of these buildings were often old timbers that were used as structural supports, roof beams and the like, and they uncovered those and examined those, dated the buildings by that. They dated the trees, looked at the tree rings, and worked out what the temperature was in particular years. So a rather good technique that didn't involve cutting down heritage trees left, right and centre. They combined that with a bunch of other things. These are Arctic cores being taken in some very, very cold region in the far north of the Earth, and they take these big, big, long, deep cores and they look at what appears in different layers of ice, different pollens, different smoke particles and the like, and by that they can get some idea of what was going on with the temperature in a particular year. The deeper down you go into the ice, the older the ice presumably is, and you can make some sort of guesstimate about what was happening in that year. They combine that with silt taken from the bottom of very, very still lakes, and again they're looking at what is in that silt, and also coral bleaching. And by combining all these factors, they were able to make that magnificent temperature map for the world for the last 2,000 years that we were looking at there. And you might be saying, oh, that's very interesting, cold snap 2,000 years ago, big deal. What are we talking about? Well, this is a map of the Byzantine Empire at its peak, just before the time of Justinian. It was, in fact, at its greatest during the reign of Justinian. And I'd like us all to turn up a passage, Revelation chapter 8. Just remind ourselves of what is happening at this period in history. So, the Byzantine Empire in the east has been growing and growing, but the Western Roman Empire has been being pummeled by the barbarians, pummeled almost to extinction by this point. And that's what's recorded in the early verses of Revelation chapter 8. And then in Revelation chapter 8 and verse 13, John says, I beheld and heard an angel flying through the midst of heaven, saying with a loud voice, Woe, woe, woe! Woe to the inhabitants of the earth by reason of the other voices of the trumpet of the three angels that have yet to sound. Three more angels blowing woe trumpets. And now the searchlight of God's attention is going to turn away from the east, away from the west. The Western Roman Empire that for the last few hundred years has been pummeled by successive barbarian invasions. And now the attention of Yahweh turns to the east. Turns to the Byzantine Empire. And you see, the Byzantine Empire is at its greatest under Justinian. But we need to go on. Revelation chapter 9 and verse 1, the fifth angel sounds, and John saw a star fall from heaven unto the earth, and to him was given the key of the bottomless pit, and things are going to come up. They're coming out. And what's coming out? Well, we know from what we know of Revelation that this describes the rise of the Islamic caliphate that was going to grow and grow and grow and threaten the Roman Empire and serve as God's tool with which to punish Catholic Europe and the Byzantine Empire. And so we're at a period of time where the Byzantine Empire occupies the area that is required in order for this Islamic caliphate to begin growing. The Islamic caliphate is just in its infancy and it needs space to grow, but the Byzantine Empire is terrifically strong at this point in time. It's propping up the Western Roman Empire in the face of barbarian hordes and still has strength to spare. And so God needs to work in order to weaken the Byzantine Empire so that the Islamic Caliphate can grow as predicted in Revelation chapter 9. So what happened? Well, this is where we get to our cold spell, because that cold spell that we were looking at was roughly the early 500s. The early 500s. And here's a man by the name of Flavius Cassiodorus. And by the way, if any of you are looking for names for children, Cassiodorus might be one you'd like to think of. Writing a personal history, and he writes about 536, and he says, the sun seems to have lost its wonted light and appears to have a bluish colour. We marvel to see no shadows of our bodies at noon, to feel the mighty vigour of the sun's heat wasted into feebleness, and the phenomena which accompany an eclipse prolonged throughout a whole year. We've had a summer without heat. The crops have been chilled by north winds, and the rain is denied. So this man was a bit of a statesman, a Roman statesman and a writer. He was actually serving at this time in the Western Roman Empire, which was ruled at that point by Theodoric the Great, one of the kings of the Ostrogoths. And he writes about the weather in 536, and he says, well, it's It's strange. It's almost like we've got an ongoing eclipse. Michael the Syrian, who was a leader in the Syrian church in Crusader-held Jerusalem some years later, wrote a long history called the Chronicle. And in the Chronicle, he writes about this period of time. And he says that the sun became dark and its darkness lasted for 18 months. Each day it shone for about 4 hours, and still this light was only a feeble shadow. Now, this man's writings are accurate enough to have been used by NASA at various different points to pinpoint different weather effects that NASA has uncovered have happened around the world. But what we need to work out is, what is this? What's going on here in 536 that Michael the Syrian and Cassiodorus are talking about? Well, there's been a number of suggestions, but one of the best suggestions is this. So, this is the video that you're seeing running there of a volcano is not actually a video of a volcano that happened in 536, in case you're wondering. That's a much more recent video from about 2002. But the imagery here is of the Ilopango eruption site. At the time of around 533, this here was actually a mountain. By 536, it was no longer a mountain and was swiftly becoming a lake. And what scientists believe is that there was an exceptionally large volcano that happened around 535 to 536 in El Salvador. A massive volcano. It caused what was called the dust veil. It put so much material up into the stratosphere that it cooled the Earth for well over a year. 84 cubic kilometers of ejecta has supposedly been pushed out by this particular volcano dated to 536 AD. Now, scientists have a scale for how big volcanoes is, and this is from Wikipedia. This is the scale. They've got wonderful names for the different settings on the scale. So level 0 of a volcano, this is the Volcano Explosivity Index. A level 0 volcano is effusive. It's kind of a nice word, isn't it? It's just an effusive volcano. A level 1 is described as a gentle volcano. Level 2, we get to an explosive volcano. Level 3 is described as catastrophic. Level 4 is cataclysmic. Level 5 is paroxysmic. Level 6 is colossal. Level 7 is megacolossal. You can see they're running out of words here. And level 8, they get to apocalyptic. Now, what does that actually mean in terms we might understand? Well, a level 5 volcano is large enough that it will send a plume of smoke and of ash 10 kilometers straight up. And worldwide, we expect to have one of these about every 12 years. Colossal, level 6, means they're going to have a plume roughly 20 kilometers straight up, and they happen once every 100 years. The one that we're talking about here that happened in 536 and caused the globe to go cold for about 18 months, we believe sent a plume of ash and of rock 25 kilometers straight up. So about 3 times the height of Everest. By comparison, Krakatoa, 18 kilometers straight up. This volcano, we believe, back in 536, sent ash as high as 80 kilometers up. It darkened the sky for years. It increased the sulfur dioxide content of the planet, thus dropping the temperature of the globe, and dropped the temperature of the globe by about 2 degrees. Now, that's all very theoretical. What I want to do is try and put this into a little bit of perspective for us. So, the video you're now watching is of the largest explosive device ever created by humanity and dropped. This is the Tsar Bomba. It's a nuclear bomb that was developed by the Russians. Who else? Of course. And it was dropped over Siberia. The video you're seeing was taken from 161 kilometers away from the bomb site. This bomb is a 50 megaton bomb, so it's about 3.3 thousand times larger than Hiroshima. The mushroom cloud that you're seeing ends up being about 64 kilometers high, 95 kilometers wide, and if you were standing over 100 kilometers away from the bomb site, you would die from third-degree burns. This is a big bomb. By comparison, the volcano that we're talking about here back in 536 was about 2,000 megatons. So this is a 50 megaton bomb. The volcano we're talking about was 2,000 megatons. Absolutely massive. It fits about there on our scale. So this is a big explosion on the other side of the world, and it's going to affect the entire globe. And what followed was, well, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, wasn't it? Famine and drought, starvation, flooding, and the spread of disease. And it's this last that we want to have a look at now, because you see, what was happening is the empire was just starting to recover in 536 from the effects of the onslaught of successive raids by barbarians after barbarians, all with wonderful names like Vandals and Huns and Goths and Ostrogoths and you name it. And they had been raiding for centuries now. But now Justinian's on the scene. There's a bit of peace, a strong emperor in the west, and all of a sudden the weather turns sour. Famine, drought, cold weather meant poor crops, particularly in Europe, and people were weakened by hunger. There was flooding, and then the spread of disease. And this is from another historian, Evagrius Scholasticus, and he writes, speaking of 541, he says, "I will also describe the circumstance of the pestilence which commenced in that period and now has prevailed over and extended over the whole earth. 2 years after the capture of Antioch by the Persians," note that, by the way, the Persians, by that, what he means by that is the Islamic people to his east. 2 years after that, a pestilence broke out. It took its rise from Ethiopia, as reported, and has made a circuit of the whole world in succession, leaving, as I suppose of it, no part of the human race unvisited by the disease. Some cities were so severely afflicted as to be altogether depopulated, though in other places the visitation was less violent. Now, this man writes from bitter personal experience. He actually caught this disease as a boy, and he now, as a historian many years later, looks back on these events. Another historian, Procipius, writing at roughly the same time, the principal historian of the 5th century, says, "During this times there was a pestilence by which the whole human race came nigh to annihilation." And he writes later on that some cities, they were finding that there would be 5,000 dead a day, others 10,000 dead a day. A terrifying time. As much as half the population of Catholic Europe was decimated by this particular disease. Unmanned ships were washing ashore on the coasts of Europe. Monasteries were completely wiped out, and it would be years before people would discover that no one was living in them anymore due to this terrible disease. What was this disease? Where did it come from? Well, these are fleas. In case you're wondering, that's the actual size. They're not actually really, really big fleas, in case you're worried they might be out there somewhere. Now, these are 2 very different fleas. One of these is a flea we don't really need to be worried about. Might make us a bit itchy. One of these is a flea we do need to be worried about, because these fleas are carrying a disease. They're carrying the Black Plague. In fact, this is the first recorded outbreak of the Black Plague, particularly in Europe. The Black Death, Yersinia pestis, is its family name. Now, the plague does a very, very interesting thing to these fleas, because what it does, I don't know if you can see that darker section. Not on this one, just on this one. See, what the plague does is it causes the gut of a flea to block up. Now, the consequence of a flea having a blocked gut is that they constantly feel hungry. They can eat and eat and eat, but they always feel hungry. And as a consequence, they go on a bit of a feeding frenzy, biting wherever they go, infecting more and more people with the Black Plague. Except that this only happens under certain conditions. This blockage will only happen when the temperature is below 25 degrees. So cold temperatures mean that this flea, that presumably in the area in which it is indigenous, always carries this bug, this Black Plague. Cooler temperatures mean that not only does this bug have a blockage and it goes biting, but it has other effects as well. You see, there's another problem. That's a rat, just in case you're wondering as well. Rats are the horses of fleas. Very, very small horses, but all the same, they are the steeds upon which these plagues ride into the lives of the Europeans. These particular rats, well, there's an interesting correlation. As the temperature drops, the rat population tends to rise. But also, as the temperature drops, rats move indoors. Now that's important. That's very important for understanding what's happening here, because you see, this plague broke out down here in Ethiopia. What was Ethiopia at the time? Well, at the time, this territory all through here was the grain bowl of Europe. This was the area in which massive farms were growing food with which to feed Europe. And remember, from 535 on, Europe has had cold temperatures, bad harvests, hail and snow, and the consequence is there's not a lot of food in Europe. And so Catholic Europe is using its estates all of the way through Africa to feed itself. And way down here, there's a bug that has a plague. And now the temperatures drop below 25, and that bug is on a feeding frenzy. But what's more, it rides on rats. Now, normally those rats stay out in the fields because they don't need to come in. But now the temperature is low. The population of rats is rising, and furthermore, they're moving indoors. Where do they move indoors to? Well, they move indoors to where there's food. Where's their food? Well, it's the big places where we're storing all the grain that we're growing down here. And what happens to that grain? Well, it goes on boats. Where to? Europe. And so all of a sudden, there's a perfect storm, if you like. Cold weather's coupled with the plague, coupled with fleas that have a gut blockage. That means they bite and bite and bite, ride on the backs of rats that normally stay outdoors but now go indoors because of cold temperatures. And an area that doesn't always provide loads of food to Europe is now all of a sudden the main staple provider of food for Europe, and the Black Plague arrives in Europe for the first time. It came from Africa. So on the other side of the world, a volcano blows up, the temperature drops, and the consequence is the Black Plague arrives in Catholic Europe. And the world changed. Here's the Byzantine Empire, just before the period in which we're talking. And here's what it looked like very soon after. Fragmented and broken, with the Arabic Caliphate on the rise. The armies of the Eastern European Byzantine Empire were severely weakened by the flood of the plague through their ranks, and the consequence was they were only able to defend themselves. No longer were they able to defend the Western Roman kingdom. No longer were they able to defend their own eastern flank. And God's prediction in Revelation chapter 9 came to pass because he made it come to pass. And the Arabic hordes began to grow stronger. So, a storm of sorts on the other side of the world changed the world, and because of that, Bible prophecy was fulfilled. God ensuring that his word would come to pass exactly as he said. So let's move on out of the time of Justinian. We're now going into the time of Kublai Khan. And let's just read the passage that relates to that in Revelation. Revelation chapter 9 and verse 14 and 15, where it says that John hears a voice saying to the sixth angel which had the trumpet, verse 14 of Revelation 9, "Loose the four angels which are bound in the great river Euphrates." And the four angels were loosed, which were prepared for an hour and a day and a month and a year to slay the third part of men. So here we've got a description of four angels, which we believe represent four different, if you like, infant nations bound up in the curves and the twines of the river Euphrates, waiting for their purpose which God has reserved for them. They have a purpose that God has prepared them for, and now John is hearing the words, let them go, unleash them, let these four angelic nations come out and do the job that God has prepared them for. And we think that these are the four nations, the Seljuks, the Mongols, the Tartars and the Ottomans, all of whom were going to serve the purpose of God in punishing the Eastern Roman Empire. And we're told in that verse that there's a period of time, an hour, a day, a month, a year. And you'll know, those of you who've done some study on the subject, that there are several different interpretations on exactly how this works. Brother Thomas's is that we've got a period of time that lasts 391 days, 1 hour. He takes the day for a year period, and that becomes 391 years and a month. And he takes it from the marriage of a gentleman by the name of Togrul Beg through to the fall of Constantinople. And with Brother Thomas's calculation, it's perfect to the day. Now, some of you will have a different idea of exactly how this time period runs, but for the purposes of what we're talking about tonight, that's not so important. What is important is to know that God had a precise time in mind in which these angels would be working. They're prepared to do a work over a precise period described here as an hour, a day, a month, and a year. The timing is critical, in other words. God's told us that. The timing of what these four angel nations are going to do on God's behalf is absolutely critical. And all four of these nations need to have their time in the sun. The Seljuks and the Mongols and the Tartars and the Ottomans all have to do their work. You can't have three of them doing their work and one of them going missing in history, because then we would have a problem, because the chapter says there will be four angelic nations and history says there were only three. What do we do? And God is never imprecise in the way his prophecies are fulfilled. So we want to see how that happened. So what we've got up here is a bit of a chart of the expansion of the Mongols. What did the Mongols do? Well, the Mongols took down the Seljuks. The Mongols took the Seljuks out and began to grow and become the dominant Islamic nation in the world. But look at what's happening here. See, this is where Constantinople is. This is the seat of the Eastern Roman Empire. Look at how close they get. Oh, so close. And then the tide retreats. Because you see, God didn't want the Mongols to take Constantinople. That job was reserved for another one of the angels. And so the Mongols got so close, but it wasn't their task. How did God ensure that the Mongols didn't actually get there and finish the job and leave nothing to do for the Tartars and the Ottomans? Well, it came down to Kublai Khan. Here he is. For those of you who thinks he looks somewhat oriental, yes, you're right. This gentleman ruled, well, he was basically from Mongolia, and he ruled the largest empire at the time in the world. He governed the Golden Horde, which was his massive army, which, as you saw on the map previously, extended all of the way from the middle of Eastern Europe across into China and down almost as far as Burma. What stopped him? What stopped him getting to Constantinople? Well, it actually wasn't events near Constantinople. It was on the other side of the world. He was stopped because he tried to invade Japan. Not once, but twice, in fact. He tried to invade Japan twice in a row. The first time he invaded Japan with 900 ships, and there was a big storm. Wiped his navy out. Lost the whole lot. So a few years later, he tried again. This time, he had two separate forces coming from two separate directions. The first force had 900 ships and 40,000 soldiers. The second force had 3,500 ships and 100,000 soldiers. Quite possibly the largest armada ever assembled in history. And guess what happened? There was a storm. The Japanese used the word kamikaze to describe that storm. The storm which protected them. The divine wind. Well, isn't that interesting? The Japanese call the storm that protected them on that occasion divine wind, the kamikaze. And so here is Kublai Khan with his massive army closing in on Constantinople, but But he's a greedy man. He's got his attention in many places at once. And on the other side of the world, he's trying to take on Japan. And God sends storm after storm, which distracts him, which weakens him, which takes his attention away from the east. And the tide retreats. The Mongols are weakened. Kublai Khan dies soon after. And his empire begins to fragment. The Mongols weren't ever meant to take Constantinople. There's still 2 angels to go. The Tartars are up next. And now it's their time in the sun. Tartars are coming. Here's the key leader of the Tartars. His name is Tamerlane. Timur the Lame. He had a limp, we're told. And he too tried to take on Constantinople. And yet, he too died on the other side of the world, fighting, of all people, the Ming dynasty in China. What stopped him from finishing his work and becoming an emperor across, well, most of Asia and into Europe, taking Constantinople? What stopped him? Just the bitterest winter on record. His troops are recorded as having to dig through as much as 5 feet of ice to reach drinking water. And this huge storm that defeated his troops in China delayed Tamerlane from advancing on Constantinople, and the consequence was Constantinople would not be invaded for another 50 years. When it finally came time, it would be the Ottomans that would do the job, and, well, using Brother Thomas's chronology, if you like that, it would be spot on time. Why? Well, because the Mongols were delayed by a storm. And Tamerlane and his Tartars were delayed by a storm. And so finally it was left to the 4th angel, the Ottomans. Each of these empires wanted to rule the world, but God said, no, it's not your turn, it's not your time. God is absolutely in control of the timing. And he's got amazing tools at his disposal with which to make sure the events which he has said will happen, do happen. All right, into British history now. Many of us will know this passage from Elpis Israel, in which Brother Thomas spoke of a strong trading Britain. Having read the Bible, read many of the passages that we looked at in our first study, he realised that there is then a partial and primary restoration of the Jews before the manifestation, that is, before Christ comes, which is to serve as the nucleus or basis of future operations and the restoration of the rest of the tribes which after he has appeared in the kingdom. So what he's saying is the Jews have to go back to the promised land before Christ comes. The pre-adventual, the return of the Jews before Christ comes, the colonization by those Jews of Palestine will be on purely political motives, and the Jewish colonists will return in unbelief of the Messiahship of Jesus and of the truth as it is in him. They will immigrate thither as agriculturalists and traders in the hope of ultimately establishing their commonwealth, but more immediately of getting rich in silver and gold by commerce with India, and in cattle and goods by their industry at home. And here it is, under the efficient protection of the British power. Brother Thomas knew long before 1948, long before 1917, that God had a purpose for the British people, and that was to support the establishment of a Jewish state prior to the return of Jesus Christ. He knew that from Bible study. And we, looking back on these events, can see how he worked it out. But what we want to look at now is, how did it actually happen? How was it that Britain, a tiny little island, not the scale and mass of somewhere like Russia or Germany or France, not that cohesive body of soldiers, a little island off the coast, separated by water. Anywhere they want to invade, they've got to first hop on a ship. They can't just mount an army, they've also got to mount a navy. How did it happen that this nation came to rule the world? Well, King Philip of Spain. King Philip of Spain, you can see that photo from the time, cheerful looking chap. From what we understand, he did always wear black. He was known for sitting hour after hour in an unheated office in his palace, working studiously on ruling his vast empire, because he was the ruler of Catholic Spain, which, well, it had dominions right across the globe at the time, all of the way from South America through into Africa. And he was a strong and powerful ruler, and he only had two interests in life: ruling the world as much of it as he could, and then making sure as much of that world that he ruled was Catholic, 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 Catholic. He was Catholic to the core. Now this lady here, also very cheerful, they make a lovely couple, is Mrs. King Philip. Her other name is Queen Mary I of England. Very good Catholic, and they got married because, well, they saw eye to eye on a number of things, except for the fact that Britain should be part of Spain. But when this lady died, her half-sister, we'll call her Liz, came to power. Now, Liz, unfortunately, was a Protestant. She was not a Catholic, and she was also not King Philip's wife. And under her reign, England became no longer Catholic. I'm abbreviating events somewhat here for the sake of time. So England was no longer Catholic, and England was no longer Philip's, given, well, the ruler was no longer married to Philip of Spain. Now, Philip, being the sort of person he was, did briefly consider marrying her anyway, but somehow he never got round to it, given she was a Protestant. And then Philip made the mistake of siding with Mary, Queen of Scots, and as those of you who know your history will know, that did not end particularly well, because things got quite ugly. Poor old Mary, Queen of Scots, ends up in the Tower of London, and then eventually her head gets cut off. Not a good end. Now, the consequence of Mary, Queen of Scots, having her head cut off by this cheerful-looking lady is that Prince Philip wasn't particularly impressed with her, given, well, she was Catholic, that is, Mary, Queen of Scots was, and Liz wasn't. So, there were a few things that Philip wasn't real happy about, but the next thing was King Philip, had also invaded the Netherlands, and had taken over all of the Dutch counties. And, well, Elizabeth thought it might be a good idea to support the Dutch, so she actually sent a navy in with a bunch of soldiers and attempted to kick King Philip's troops out. She wasn't actually successful in that, but that thoroughly annoyed Philip in Spain, and so he decided to invade. He mounted a huge armada, known as the Spanish Armada, 130 ships, 8,000 sailors, and 18,000 soldiers, and embarked for Merry England. England, on the other hand, had this gentleman, Sir Francis Drake. He was actually a pirate. He became Sir Francis because of services to the kingdom, but those services mainly were being a pirate. Queen Liz was quite fond of pirates, because what would happen is when the pirate would return with all their loot and doubloons and booty and the like, she would get her cut. And so she was in favour of people who brought her big cuts of doubloons, particularly if they were Spanish, and this man was very, very good at collecting doubloons on the high seas. So Sir Francis Drake, under the instructions of Queen Elizabeth, mounted his own navy, created his own navy, which was actually very difficult in England at the time, given they didn't actually have a formal navy. He just collected a bunch of ships from people out there. They actually managed to collect 200 ships, significantly more than the French, but they had 50% less guns, which is a problem if you think about it. It's all very well and good to have a big navy, but if you haven't got anything to, if they're just going to sort of row around the place crashing into each other, it becomes more like a fairground scene rather than a war. And so that was a problem. But there was a bigger problem here, because, see, Elizabeth was actually very, very keen on saving money. Not only did she like people bringing her doubloons, she didn't like giving anyone else doubloons. And so she said to Sir Francis Drake, look, you're going to build this navy with pretty much no money. Is that okay with you? And he said, no, it's not really. And she said, well, tough. That wasn't good, because when this navy set to sea to take on the Spanish Armada, which, as we recall, was loaded with 18,000 soldiers intent on arriving in Britain and invading Britain and making Britain Catholic, when that happened, Sir Francis Drake's entire navy had enough ammunition for 1 day's fighting. 12 hours. And after that, they were all out. That was it. They were going to have to go back, make some more. And add to that, there was no defence in England. There weren't sort of little groups of soldiers dotted around the coastline, holding hands around the coastline saying, if anyone speaks Spanish, we won't let them pass. There was none of that. The English people hadn't really mounted any form of coastal defence. All they had was Sir Francis Drake's navy. That's it. And they've got enough ammunition for one day. Not a really good way to defend your kingdom. And clearly Queen Liz wasn't looking forward particularly well at this point. She wasn't planning particularly well. Now this is important. This is very important, because if Britain had become Catholic, you can bet your bottom dollar that 200, 300 years on, they would still be Catholic and wouldn't be keen on supporting the Jewish people, would they? That's not something a Catholic nation does. But this nation has to remain Protestant. So how did that happen? Well, Sir Francis Drake found out where the Spanish Armada was going. Because you see, the Spanish Armada left Spain without its soldiers, or at least without all its soldiers on board. And they were actually heading up the coast of France to pick up more soldiers. And so, Sir Francis Drake, wouldn't that be interesting if he turned out to be a brother? All right, Sir Francis Drake and his merry pirate band came out and they harassed the Spanish Armada as they were going. There were a number of engagements. The British were much better at shooting their cannons. The British could shoot their cannons, each cannon, once every 30 minutes, whereas the Spanish could shoot their cannons once every 2 hours, because it took them 2 hours to reload. Yeah, that's really, really slow. But so the battles were quite slow. There were two major engagements on the high seas, and in those engagements, pretty much no one died. No ships were sunk. A couple of Spanish ships lost a bit of rigging, but there really wasn't much damage being done. Mainly because Sir Francis Drake was preserving ammunition. So the British had just come up, fly up a few flags, shoot off a few guns, and run away again. It wasn't until the Spanish Armada pulled into a place called Gravelines that things got interesting. They were heading up past Gravelines to pick up soldiers, and Gravelines was a shallow water port I think on the French coast, up near the Netherlands. What did Sir Francis Drake do? Well, he had 200 ships, so he had a few to spare. He picked out a few clunkers. In the middle of the night, he got these clunkers, he lined them up, set sail on them, and then set them on fire. Sent them in towards the coast. So from a Spanish perspective, you've got all of your ships lying along the coast at Gravelines. They've got their anchors down because it's nighttime, and really bad idea to be sailing in the dark at nighttime if you don't have a radar. And none of them had bothered to get a radar. Disappointing, but that's what they've done. And these fire ships come sailing in towards them. Now, at the time, fire was the greatest fear of a sailor. So what happened? Each of the Spanish ships had to get out of the way of the fire ships, because if these blazing boats crashed into you, your ship would catch fire and everything would just really go badly for you. So what they did, a lot of them thought, we have to get out of here extremely quickly, and they cut their anchors off. They didn't bother pulling them up because they didn't have time. They just cut the anchors off and headed out to sea. Wasn't a big deal, really. As far as we know, only one ship was lost, run aground, and so the Spanish Armada still had, 129 ships approximately. They then had to engage with the British. The British fought the Spanish Armada till about 4 p.m, at which point the British ran out of ammunition, totally, and headed back to Britain. And how many ships had been sunk? About 5 or 6 Spanish ships by that point. The Spanish at this point still have their whole armada basically heading up the coast of Britain, and the British Navy has run out of ammunition. What happened next? Well, here's what happened next. A big storm. Now, again, for those of you wondering how I managed to get footage of the Spanish Armada's storm, this is actually not the Spanish Armada. This is, I think it's actually the South African Navy in the Atlantic. Be that as it may, what happened is, there's Spain for those of you who like Spain. There's France. Here's Britain, Great Britain. And Gravelines is, I can't see it on the map from where I'm standing, but it's around here. And so a number of engagements happened between the British and the Spanish here. The British give up at about 4 p.m. in the afternoon, head back to base, and the Spanish, well, what happened? Well, the wind whipped up, and the Spanish got sent up here and up here and up here. And you think to yourself, well, why didn't they stop? Why didn't they just pull into harbour, stop, wait till the storm blew over? They had no anchors. They'd lost them all at Grapevines, hadn't they? And so these poor Spanish go all the way up here, and the breeze is still blowing, the breeze is still blowing, and breeze is still blowing. And in fact, if you go to bits of Scotland up here, you will find there are people who live all the way up here who look decidedly Spanish. There's a reason for that. It's because some of the ships finally got up here in a bracing storm and decided we've had enough, and they ran aground up here. And so there are Spanish-appearing people living way up here, even still. So most of the ships kept going, and they came down here, came down here, came down here, and what happened there? Another storm, but this one was worse. This was an Atlantic storm. A terrible, terrible storm. In fact, we're told that this particular year was a year of incredible storms, incredible cold weather. They called it a mini ice age at the time. So the wind has forced the Spanish Armada north. They've got to go round around Scotland, and their plan was we're going to come round the back of Scotland, go all the way around here, back home to Spain, pick up some more food and have another crack at it. But that wasn't to be. The Atlantic storms came crashing in, and look at that. Every one of these is a marking of where a Spanish ship went down. All along the coast of Ireland, the Spanish ships sunk and sunk and sunk and sunk. The ships were beginning to show wear and tear from their long voyage. Some were only kept together by large ropes and cables that were tied around underneath the ship. Supplies of food and water ran short. The cavalry horses were cast overboard into the sea. Devastating storms meant that they were incapable of sheltering, and the consequence was many of these ships ended up washing up on the coast of Ireland, and surprisingly, the Irish didn't want to see them and killed a lot of them on their arrival. 2 huge storms that devastated the Spanish Armada. It was nothing to do with Sir Francis Drake, nothing to do with the British. That's not what saved Britain in the time of the Spanish Armada. It was a storm, and what's more, the British people knew that. After this event, they minted a medal. The medal said on it, Flavit Jehovah et dissipati sunt. Someone out here probably knows how to pronounce this. I just made that up in terms of pronunciation, so you can correct me over supper if you like. But it means simply, God blew with his winds and they were scattered. The British knew. They knew that they didn't win that victory. They had enough gunpowder for one day, and then they ran away. What saved them? The storms did. 1596, Philip had another crack. 1597, another crack. 2 more armadas came. Do you know what stopped both of them? Storms, again. And by the end of Elizabeth's reign, she ruled the world from east to west. They said that during her reign, the sun never set. It went from being a tiny little kingdom with few dominions to a massive kingdom which had picked up most of the land territory of the Spanish Empire across the globe. And what did it? Storms. In the end, Britain was to become the largest empire in history in almost every possible measure. At its peak, it had 32 million square kilometres, 22% of the world's landmass, 458 million people, or 20% of the world's population. And it was done by storms. Not by gunpowder, not by clever British people, by storms. All right, let's rush on to our last one. Revelation 11 verse 3 speaks of the 2 witnesses, and it says that the 2 witnesses are going to witness for a specific time period. And we believe that that time period really begins with the time of Justinian that we've already looked at, and it's going to end with the French Revolution, when now the persecution of the 2 witnesses is finally over, and the Catholic might within Europe is going to be cut down by the events of the French Revolution. So in 529, Justinian wrote his codex. Now, we don't have his codex, but we have letters describing what was in his codex that he wrote in 529. And we believe that in this codex that Justinian wrote, he said that the Pope was the boss of all the churches and he could pretty much do what he liked. It made the Pope the ruler who he was going to be throughout the rest of history, up until the French Revolution cut him down to size. And that was done in 529 by Justinian. So, we've got to come 1,260 years from 529 through to the French Revolution. And we've got to work out, how did God achieve that? How did God get the French Revolution so precisely timed? Such a big and important event would be difficult to time, given it involves many millions of people, whole countries, and significant events. Well, here's part of how God timed it. What we're looking at here is what's left of another volcano. A volcano that erupted in June the 8th, 1783. It erupted for 8 months, and as far as we know, is the most deadly eruption in recorded history. It was only 6 on the explosivity scale that we all now remember. In other words, it was only colossal as far as eruptions go. But it erupted for an 8-month period from this particular fissure in Iceland. Tiny little volcano, tiny little country, and yet one of the most deadly volcanoes in history, because it pumped out clouds of poisonous hydrofluoric acid and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. It killed over 50% of the livestock population in Iceland, and it led to a famine that killed 25% of the people within Iceland. But its effects are going to be global, because the cloud that came spewing out of this particular volcano would spread around the world. And this cloud was going to have global effects for the next few years, from 1783 onwards. The weather, we're told, became very hot, causing severe thunderstorms with large hailstones that were reported to have killed cattle. That's big hailstones. Until the haze dissipated in the autumn. The winter of 1783-84 was very severe. The naturalist Gilbert White wrote, he lived in England at the time, and he reported 28 days of continuous frost. The extreme weather is estimated to have caused 8,000 additional deaths in the UK alone. During the spring thaw, Germany and Central Europe reported severe flood damage, all as a result of what had come from this volcano in Iceland. And the effects of this volcano spread on and on throughout Europe. In France, the sequence of extreme events included a surplus harvest in 1785, a surplus harvest, lots and lots of food in 1785. That meant the price of that harvest plunged. The price of food plunged throughout France and caused poverty for rural workers. But that was combined with droughts and with bad winters and summers, and finally a violent hailstorm in 1781 that destroyed crops. 1788 that destroyed crops. The end result of that was French farmers had a surplus harvest. That meant prices plunged and they couldn't afford anything. They were bankrupted. Followed by a series of bad harvests, which meant they had nothing to sell and nothing to eat. And in the end, this particular volcano is believed to have contributed to as many as 5 million deaths worldwide, including as many as 1 million as far away as Japan. It dropped temperatures by up to 5 degrees as far away as the United States of America. Now, there were a number of other factors going on at the same time. There was another major volcano erupting at the same time. There was also a massive El Nino pattern which had developed from around 1789. And then on July the 13th, 1788, a great hailstorm burst over southern France. One particular gardener recorded that the stones were so monstrous that it killed hares and partridges, ripped branches from trees, ruined crops, laid fields waste. And they said they hadn't seen anything this bad in 80 years. 80 years. And 6 months later, those same farmers stormed the Bastille. Run down after years of bad crops, no food, hailstorms, weather that destroyed their livelihood, coupled with the fact that they were at the bottom of society and those at the top, the clergy and the nobles refused to give them a break. The sans-culottes marched on the Bastille, and on the 14th of July, 1789, the French Revolution began. How did God do that? Well, it was weather, wasn't it? Weather event after weather event after weather event, pummeling France, such that finally, in 1789, the French people had had enough. All right, we're almost finished. Hopefully what we've seen is, again and again, God has used weather to precisely time global events, to make sure that events that he's predicted in the scriptures of truth will happen exactly when he said they would. He says they'll happen on this particular year. They happen on that particular year. Why? Because a volcano the other side of the world, a flea that just happens to be particularly hungry. Any one of a number of things, God is working and using these global weather events to make sure that the prophecies that he has written down will occur exactly when he says they will. Some of you may have seen this video. It's taken from a movie that came out 10 or so years ago called The Day After Tomorrow. I was travelling home from a youth conference when I saw this movie on the plane. I was quite pleased with myself. I got onto the plane, I got upgraded to business class. I thought, well, aren't I special? I'm in business class. Look at me. And then the hostess came down the aisle. Champagne for you, sir. Champagne for you, sir. Came to me. Would you like orange juice? Oh, why does that always happen? Actually, she said, would you like orange juice sunny, which made it even worse. But anyway, I was on the brink of saying I'll have the champagne anyway. But as it happened, this movie came on, and I sat in my seat and I looked at this. And I'll tell you the truth, I actually sat in my seat and I cried. Because what I was looking at, I felt like I was seeing the events that are coming on this globe. Because God has said he's going to use weather. Again, that's the verse we started our night with. Stormy wind fulfilling his word. Job says, who knows the treasure of the hail and the snow that God has reserved to the day of judgment. We know that there'll be a great earthquake. We know that Zechariah 14 speaks of the Battle of Armageddon as a day of great and terrible cold. There'll be amazing weather effects in the Battle of Armageddon, but terrible, terrible weather effects. Tragic weather effects for the whole world. And I sat there and I watched this movie play, and I saw what was going to happen here and around the world. And I'll tell you, I just sat there and cried. God is going to use weather again. He's used it, and he's used it all the way from the beginning of time to fulfill his word. And he's going to use it again. And we've had a wonderful time together today, brothers and sisters. We have been reminded of the power of God. He said events would happen in Europe. They are happening. He said that Russia would invade the Middle of East. We're there, brothers and sisters. I don't care whether you're alive for 56 or 48 or 73 or any one of those other major events in history. Nobody has seen Russia standing on the borders of the Promised Land, but every one of us here do. We're all standing there seeing Russia right on the borders of the Promised Land. And this stuff is about to start happening. And we've been reminded of the absolute certainty. And a day like this should not be academic. We can't let this be academic. This is not just because it's interesting, not because we can understand what the words say. This should be life-changing. And all of us need to remind ourselves of why we're here. We're here because we love our God and because we love the appearing of Jesus Christ, and we pray for the peace of Jerusalem. That's why we're here. And that should motivate us to go home and do the things that we need to do to be ready for this day. It's not academic. We're not doing this because we like newspaper cuttings. We're doing this because we love God and we love his son's appearing. That day's coming. It really is. And it's going to be terrible for the world, but it won't be for us. But we need to make sure we're doing the things that God wishes us to do, and you all know what that is. And on the other side, it's going to be like this. He shall be as the light of the morning when the sun rises, even a morning without clouds, as the tender grass springing out of the earth by clear shining after rain. We all want to be there. Every one of us, we want to be there together in that cloudless day. No storms on the horizon ever again. And the day when he stands there like the Son of Righteousness with healing in his wings. And I look forward to being there with every one of you, brothers and sisters, if our Lord wills.
BibleTruthAndProphecy.com is a worldwide collaboration by Christadelphians to help promote the understanding of God's Word to those who are seeking the truth about the human condition and God's plan and purpose with this earth and with mankind upon it. Bible Truth and Prophecy is part of a wider set of online resources provided by Christadelphianvideo.org for establishing just how far removed the true Christian teaching of the first century apostles is from that taught by mainstream Christendom today. BibleTruthAndProphecy.com is very much a standalone website, but benefits from our vast network of sites and resources and social media. Here are just a few of the things that BibleTruthAndProphecy.com offers. We have a good number of written articles supplied to us from brothers from all over the globe. These deal with first principle issues, creation versus evolution, the inspiration of the Bible, and so much more. We have a whole section of video study series. These are studies that have been posted onto our YouTube channel, but because of the difficulty of the search feature within YouTube, we have chosen to host on Bible Truth and Prophecy. So now every video you search for within the site, you can be guaranteed that it will be of a Christadelphian nature. We also have a preaching video section where any ecclesia is invited to download and use or embed these videos within their own ecclesial websites. We also have an exhortation service where we produce 2 or 3 exhortations per week, which we then circulate to brethren and sisters in isolation. We also have an ever-growing list of approved Christadelphian sites. We also have a page of live news feeds, so you can keep up to date with all the breaking news as it happens. We also have a section for the daily readings. Each day at around midnight we publish all 3 of the daily readings, and then later on in the day we publish thought for the days, often based on all 3 portions of the daily readings. Within each daily reading post there is also a link to enable you to have the Bible chapter read to you directly. We also feature Bible in the News videos which we have produced from the Bible in the News website. We also feature Brother Don Pierce's milestone snippets, which come out approximately 3 times a week. We also feature Andy Walton's weekly World Watch and other commentaries and analysis from other brethren on world news events. You can also subscribe to the blog and be notified of posts as they happen in real time, and also subscribe to the weekly newsletter which is provided by Christadelphianvideo.org. Every page and post on the site has the facility to be able to leave a comment or make an observation, so please take advantage of this and let us know what you think of the site.